Hi, everyone. So this is a work that me and Dex Chen from Semantic Layer and Danny from FlashBus has been working on over the past a year or so. Um, and the problem that initially kind of started a lot of this discussion within us was that a lot of users use solver-based dexes like CalSwap, OneInch Fusion, Uniswap X, but oftentimes we don't have a lot of transparency around how well they actually execute against something like traditional AMMs like Uniswap V2, V3, and also like other pricing venues like Binance, for example. So we kind of broken down this bigger problem into questions such as this. How do solver-based dexes, like those I mentioned, compare to traditional AMMs in terms of the user execution? And this can be further broken down into which solver-based dexes give the best trade execution. And then how does all of this compare to off-chain pricing venue like Binance mid-price? And then another big question that we asked ourselves is, what is the source of liquidity for those corresponding venues, and how does it vary depending on the trade sizes and token types? Like these questions obviously like are very multifaceted, and there are many different factors that are influencing the trade execution. It's oftentimes also very hard to just pinpoint like, oh, this is the only factor. So we kind of like had to look at it from a many different angles to try to better understand this broader problem space around trade execution. So to give some context on what is solver-based dexes, this is just an example of Uniswap X, the current implementation of Uniswap X. And this may differ between CalSwap and OneInch Fusion because they have different auction mechanism as well. But to just give example with the Uniswap X, a user would essentially receive an indicative RFQ quote, which is basically fillers saying like, hey, I can fill this order at this price preemptively. And then if the users are essentially happy with it, the orders will be parameterized and then sign the orders. And once it's signed, it would actually go into the proper auction mechanism, which Uniswap uses Dutch auction for each single orders. And then with that, the fillers have to now give this hard RFQ, which is basically a hard quote that they commit to. And whoever gives the first and the best one would basically fill the orders and execute the trade corresponding for the user intent. So in this part, you'll see that the fillers, some platform call it solver, some platform call it quarters, resolvers, like there are different names there, but I'm just gonna call it filler for now. They perform a lot of operations like routings across different AMM pools, leveraging like off-chain liquidity sources like Binance's to essentially, or even their inventory, to essentially fill those orders. And which is why we believe, or in general people believe, that solver-based DEX can actually give better execution than vanilla AMMs and so forth. The landscape of solver-based DEX today looks something like this. CalSwap so far has the highest amount of like average daily volume, around 200 mil, 25% of which is contributed. So control is not the right word. Contributed by Wintermute. And then OneInch Fusion has about 60 million average daily, 80% of which is contributed by top 3 solvers, some of which I don't even know what's the name of it. Probably, you know, okay, I probably shouldn't say. Anyway, and then Uniswap X controls has roughly around 30 million daily volume, among which 90% were contributed by SCP and Wintermute. So there are actually a pretty wide spread of like composition of like solver volume that is actually contributing to those volume, and from the top is Uniswap, and then the middle is OneInch, and then a CalSwap at the bottom. And you can see just from the color like the kind of distribution you expect from those venues. So how do we measure those trade execution? We have proposed and come up with a metrics called execution warfare, which actually resembles a bit on the markup, on the pricing calculation. But for us, when we were doing the calculation, we're actually comparing the output amount from the solvers, which is the actual executed trade on chain that landed on chain, compared against counterfactual simulated trade that we did on both V2 and V3 AMMs, accounting for any gas. So we calculated the delta and then divided denominator by that AMM output amount after gas. And in similar way, we also calculated price markout. So this is, I guess, what most people would use on, I guess, more TradFi space, where they compare the price execution on the solver side, the actual executed price, and then the closest Binance price. And this was marked in like a pretty tight millisecond interval. So we try to find the closest Binance price that was available at that time, and then denominated by that. And then for the comparison purposes, we use T0 markout because I know some of you guys may like lash it out to me like, oh, T0, well, you know, we have to use T0 because to make the comparison fair between these two metrics, we had to resort to T0 markout. Yeah. We also did some gas analysis to make sure with this previous execution where we have this like amount that we have to deduct on the gas. So we analyzed the gas that were the gas price that were present across each of the blocks that we studied, and also analyzed the gas price of the solvers, the amount that solver paid, and also the amount that we could realistically expect if we were to try to like pay a very competitive gas price. And when I say competitive gas price, I mean like gas price where we can like come to near the top of the block essentially. And then this is essentially what we call it the realistic gas price. Realistic gas price, in our definition, is where the amount of price of gas that you need to pay in order to come to become the first swap of AMM in the block. If you have any questions, like feel free to ask me later as well. So to kind of jump into the results, on the left we have aggregate data of box plots for USDC WETH pairs. So this is the first pair that we looked at extensively. And you can see with the blue boxes, it's a execution warfare against V2. And one thing we note is that most of the solver-based dexes are consistently outperforming V2 execution, which were somewhat expected. It makes sense given that V2 pools have the XY close to K curve that can potentially lead to like a larger spread if the trade size is bigger and so forth, which we'll look into it later as well. And then from these, we also looked at V3 execution warfare, which is on the middle. And then we can actually see that compared to V2, like solver actually does not, well, but they still have some improvements over V3, but not as much as V2 comparatively. And then, and if you look at the green boxes, which is the pricing against Binance, we notice that, yeah, it's quite a lot of negative on that. So we kind of anticipated, but yeah, it was confirmed our belief that yes, the pricing on the solver-based DEX is still mostly underperformed Binance price, Binance mid price. And then on the right we have the Pepe WETH, which is another sort of like a longer tail-ish assets that we looked at. And we picked Pepe because it was like longer tail than ETH, but it still has the trading capacity on each corresponding venues like CowSwap or 1inch Fusion and Uniswap X. And one very important thing to note here is that dynamic has completely flipped, where previously we see that the V2 has like a solver execution has a significant advantage over V2, but in the Pepe case it does not have that much advantage over V2, and it kind of reversed, and now solver actually execute better than V3. So this, I guess, to kind of dive a bit more into this, we also broken down into like a trade sizes. So the x-axis is the trade size, and then we studied like how the trade sizes differs for those execution warfare. And for USDC WETH, as we expected, with the increasing amount of increasing trade size, the blue stick goes like up, which is suggesting that the solver execution is performing better as the trade size increases against V2. There is slight uptick on the V3 side with the orange like dots coming up. It's not very clear in the distance, but there is for execution against V3. But this also kind of like shows how like V3 is actually a lot more performant than we anticipated. And then the green dots are kind of like suggesting the Binance against the Binance price, where it's mostly negative, but like tending towards zero is what we have observed across all three venues. And then on the other side for Pepe, we noticed that like as we knew from the previous graph, like there was a flip on the dynamic, and there was indeed also flip on the dynamic on the trade size plot, where the increasing size of the trade has increased the solver execution compared against V2. But for V3, we also noticed that the small execution are not very efficient on V3. However, it becomes a more and more efficient against solver execution when the trade size increases. So this kind of like shows an interesting point where for V3, it does actually, when the liquidities are not very sufficient on V3, it doesn't do as well as like something like Pepe V2 pool, which is like 4 or 5 times more liquid than the V3 counterparts. So to kind of like have a bit more discussion here, I think it is so far clear that on the USDC WETH pair, the solver execution does outperform V2 fairly consistently. But compared against V3, it's not as clear. And likely given that because of the concentrated liquidity, that V3 actually can perform decently well with the larger trade sizes. And then, as I mentioned, Binance mid price still outperforms solver-based execution. And then increased trade sizes does enable like solvers to be able to route through many different pools and also use off-chain liquidity, so that we now have to also look into like how the liquidity sources may differ for those execution. And then one important thing that we found from this Pepe WETH study is that liquidity distribution, like how the LPs are distributed across V2 pools and V3 pools, matter quite significantly for the solver execution to be effective. Meaning that if the liquidity is too concentrated, which is the case for Pepe WETH, then we actually saw this like opposite effect where the solver doesn't perform as well as V2, but it actually outperformed V3 in a lot of the trades. So now we kind of look into the liquidity sources. At a very high level, CalSwap has most of the trades routed through AMMs. And then Uniswap X on the sort of like the contrast here has most of the trades routed through PMM, which is like off-chain sources, like from inventory or from Binance or whatever, like off-chain sources. And depending on the asset pairs, we also noticed that for long tail assets, predominant liquidity sources were on-chain, AMMs. And then it goes down as we go from pegged assets to somewhat blue chip DeFi tokens to now like ETH-BTC. And when it comes to ETH-BTC, actually like a good chunk, like 50-60% of it is actually sourced from off-chain. We break that data further into this like aggregate graph on the left, where we looked at how the AMM liquidity ratio changed over the size of the trade. And we noticed that for USDC WETH pair, it has a general upward trend of like, with increasing size, there's actually increasing amount of like AMM liquidity share going up, as you can see. But over 300K, at a point over 300K on the trade size, we noticed that there's a significant volatility, which is also an indication that from that point is where like we have a lot of like one is like a lack of like a very concentrated trading data, but at the same time there's also more and more significant amount of like trades that are going through off-chain sources due to the larger trade size. And then interestingly for Pepe WETH with the red line, we also see this trend initially going up with the AMM liquidity as the trade size increases. However, we also notice like a sharp decline after around like 75K points, where most of the trades start to get, or a lot of the trades at least start to get routed through off-chain venues. And then we also broken down by venue, which is on the right. And I know this graph is a little bit complicated, so to kind of help better understand it, I think we can first look at the two lines at the top, which is like a CalSwap USDC and a Pepe WETH paired AMM liquidity ratio. And we notice that the red line, which is the Pepe WETH ratio, is like gradual decline as the trade sizes increases. This was actually consistent with the very bottom line, which is the Uniswap Pepe WETH line, which is also going down on a downward trend as the trade size increases. So those were somewhat consistent, although like very different ratio, but it was consistent across those two venues. And another thing that were also the same between Uniswap and CalSwap was that the USDC WETH liquidity ratio were also climbing up on the AMM as the trace size increases. So you look at the second from the top blue line, and then the second from the bottom blue line, or both of them are going up gradually as the trace size increases. And then the last one is the middle two graphs, where the 1-inch fusion pipette, as you saw, it's like a crossing over down. That's like what we have seen with the previous graph, where the pipette, as the trace size increase, they start to rely on oxygen liquidity more and more. Another thing that we started looking at is like, how does the execution warfare is impacted by the market? And one thing we looked at is like realized volatility. Like, does the volatility cause significant variance on the solver execution? And what we found out is that actually there was very little effect that the market has in terms of the volatility wise on how well the solver actually executes for the user's trade execution. So to kind of summarize over a lot of this data that I just kind of like presented here, first of all, like, it is pretty clear to me that the solver execution does perform better in larger trade sizes, especially above like 300K, and that it's consistent against V2, but much less so pronounced against V3. Which also leads to another point, which is that V3 is actually fairly competitive in terms of executing larger trades. Even though like with the solver basic, you can still like get some 10 to 15 bips advantage. But that's still fairly competitive, more competitive than what I anticipated initially. Solver-based dexs also hinges heavily on the distributions of asset liquidity. So in the case of Pepe, the liquidity is so concentrated on the V2 pool that actually solver didn't have a lot of advantage in doing the routing for those trades, because most of the liquidity is just on V2. And then for the and also obviously the Binance, as I mentioned, like Binance oftentimes just offer like better price still. And then the solver liquidity sources also varies significantly depending on the venues and depending on the token types, which could be contributing significantly to also the difference that we see from the results that we have. And then finally, the execution warfare across venues, again, predominantly governed by factors like liquidity sources, LP distribution, solver competition, and trader sizes. And those are many, many different factors that could contribute to why this platform has this execution and why that platform has that execution. And obviously, I'm not here to say like which one is better or worse, but I think there are a lot of factors that we studied that contributed to a lot of the differences that we observed empirically. And then lastly, just want to say that the market impact didn't have a significant effect on the execution of those trades. Few limitation and future work that I want to highlight today is that this study unfortunately couldn't account for the batch auction delay, or like just in terms of the delay that is incurred from the auction processes. Obviously, the different platforms, different auction process, and 1-inch is really fast, and Uniswap is also pretty fast. But I know that, for example, CowSwap can be a little bit more delay. So some auction delay were not accounted for, and that's simply because we only looked at what was landed on chain, and we couldn't see what didn't land on chain. Which comes to the next point, which is selection bias and on-field orders. Because what we analyze is on-chain data, we couldn't really get hold of like all of the canceled data, canceled orders essentially, which is like maybe it's an order that the solver does not want to execute because it's not preferable for the solvers. But then those orders could be actually very preferable for the users. So those data that we don't see is a selection bias among this data. And then another thing that I also want to highlight is solver reward. And this is something that we're giving out like, I think 1.5 years ago. I'm not sure like most recently what's the update on the solver reward, but they were giving out like solver reward to like solvers to compensate for their gases and whatnot. But the thing is those reward could also incentivize some more aggressive behavior on the solver side to make sure that they have sufficient volumes and to be able to quote it at a more favorable price for the users. And then the lack of routing is something that was somewhat intended because we wanted to study more direct comparison between the pools and the solvers execution. So, but yeah, I guess we didn't have a routing on the simulation. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Any questions? very interesting results and appreciate the choice of Pepe. Any idea how much overlap there is between the participants who are the solvers and those that do just-in-time liquidity in MEV and V3?
Oh, so your question is like, what is the overlap between people who does solving and also people who does JIT on V3?
Yeah, because it's kind of like a similar kind of activity, right? Similar risk return profile, and it could, one explanation for why there's more of a convergence there on price improvement.
So as far as I know, obviously this is like not a data that we presented here, but as far as I know, there is overlaps on the people who are doing like a large volume on solving, as well as like doing like a very complicated JIT strategy on like V3. So there's definitely overlap there. I don't know in terms of exact numbers, like how many of them, because there are a lot of like, not just big actors, but like small actors that are doing various strategies. But as far as I know, a lot of the big actors are doing that, yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. My question was, you mentioned a couple of factors that made one solver-based DEX potentially better than another in terms of execution welfare. Which factor would be like the most predominant one?
That's a tough question, but I think so the reason why I think it's a tough question is because of the third point, which is the solver reward. Initially, I had a hunch that perhaps a lot of the solver reward may make solvers to be more aggressive because they can make money elsewhere. But in order to quantify how much of impact that had on the solver's execution, it's like these rewards are given retroactively to the solvers. So it's very hard for me to quantify like how much impact that the solver reward had on the actual calculation per trade basis. So, I mean, I think like the best I can do right now is like, I think these factors all matters. Like the composition of how many solvers there are, like what's the dominance level, like for example, what you see here, all matters. Like, is it like dominant by like just 1, 2 solvers, or is it like fairly competitive across all of them? Like those would all matter. So I don't, unfortunately, I can't like just pinpoint like, oh, one factor is like, is this. One thing I can say though is that depending on the assets, solver-based execution are not very effective.
Thank you.
One more question, and then we'll go to the next speaker.
Just if you could quickly explain the realized gas thing you had with the priority fees and how that was calculated.
Yeah, so the realized gas, so our definition of realistic gas is basically after we analyzed all of the block that we studied, we picked the trade that touched those V2, V3 AMM pools and at the closest to the top of the block. So basically, those guys who are near the top of the block have paid a significant amount of priority fees in order to be at the top of the block. And that also reflects the priority fee competition per block basis for each specific blocks that we studied. So we took sample of all of them, and then we aggregated and we plotted this like green numbers. Green numbers reflects like the pricing of the highest positioned AMM trade that happened per block, and then we plotted against the solver execution, which is in yellow, and realized that the realistic gas, in our definition, actually was a lot more aggressive than the solver gas price. So we actually took the more sort of like conservative approach with regards to the gas calculation, which is that realistic gas. Yeah.
I see. So it's just the priority fee for the first transaction.
First transaction that touching the AMMs. Yeah.
Let's thank Yuki.